The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Claire Gibson spent many of her formative years in West Point, New York, where her father was a professor at the United States Military Academy. That experience gave rise to her new novel, Beyond the Point. It follows a group of women Army officers in their time together at West Point and through their careers. Claire calls it The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants meets Zero Dark 30. Claire, thank you so much for being here, for being willing to talk about your writing, your process. I'm so excited about Beyond the Point. It's been so fun to see that come out here in the last little bit.
Yeah.
And I get the impression that you're a pretty disciplined writer.
Ooh, I'm glad you get that impression. It's all an act. I try to be. You know, things have changed a lot for me in the last year and a half in terms of just the way my life looks, because I'm now a mom, which I wasn't during the writing of my first novel. Uh-huh. So discipline is a lot less about, staying to one path and more about like keeping a regimen where I can keep writing. It doesn't look as identical each day the way it did, a couple years ago. Yeah. But I do try to stay disciplined. So.
What does that mean? So you said you.
Right.
What distinction are you drawing here?
Well, so having children stretches you. I don't have as much time. Mm-hmm. And so I still think I'm disciplined, but it doesn't look the same. So when I was writing Beyond the Point, I would get up every day and I would write from about 8 in the morning until about noon. Mm-hmm. And then in the afternoons, I had other jobs, other things that were helping me make money. Now, when I'm writing, I only have childcare 2 days a week. And so those days I still write from 8 to noon because that's my habit.
That's your thing. Yeah.
But then on the other days, I'm trying my best to write during nap times and during other little windows that I have. But it's not as regular. Yeah. And so it doesn't feel as disciplined to me as it did a year and a half ago because it's not daily. So I'm hoping to move more toward a daily habit because I think that's just like anything. I think the more you do it, the more habitual it becomes. And even those days off that you take make it harder to sit back down and open the page again. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So I'm looking to find a way back to daily practice rather than just 2 days a week.
Yeah. So. Now I can't remember where I ran across this. I think it was Madeleine L'Engle quoting somebody else, and that person said, when you skip one day, you lose 3 days.
Oh, 100%. And that's terrifying to hear that. But thank you. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, hopefully, like every day you skip, like if you skip 5 days, hopefully you haven't
don't
lost
do the math
15
on that,
days.
Jonathan.
I think it just means it takes 2 days to get back. But,
No, I think you're right. Or Madeline was right. But I mean, it's also a beautiful thing to be a mom and to get to spend those days with Sam now. And so it's just kind of finding a new rhythm.
Yeah.
But my dad was in the Army, so, I saw what discipline looked like and what it meant to get up early. Mm-hmm. That's adulthood. And I think a lot of the answer for me is going to be waking up earlier.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it one of those situations where Sam wakes up so early that you can't beat him up?
I just don't want to.
Just don't want to. Yeah. Okay.
I'm getting there, though. It will be. I think that's the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you? What's your discipline look like in your life?
Well, whenever I talk about discipline, it always has to be do as I say and not as I do.
Sure.
But it's definitely involves waking up early.
What does that mean for you? Because early to different people, like I wake up at 5:30 already, and some people raise their eyebrows at that. And I'm thinking probably it means 5 o'clock soon is going to be my new wake up. What about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually out of bed by 5 or 5:30.
Yeah,
and but I'm just not a person who can be productive late at night. It's just not my thing.
Same. Yeah. I love that. I have friends that are those people. Yeah, and I think that's beautiful. And I wish I was that person in some ways, but it's just not how my clock works. Yeah.
Well, especially when you have kids, no matter how early you can get up, it's hard to get up enough hours before the kids get up. It would be nice to put the kids down at 8 and then have several hours of work after that, but that's just not how my rhythms go.
I close down. Yeah. I think I'm worthless after 2 o'clock, honestly, in the afternoon.
Okay.
I try to do emails after 2 o'clock. I try to do household chore. Like I try to just kind of do mindless things after 2 o'clock, but really before 2 o'clock is my best work time. Yeah. And I think that's good. As an artist, you have to figure out when am I the most creative, when is my critical voice the quietest, and when can I have, protected time to really focus. Yeah. So
tell me about your inner critic. What is your inner critic? What's his or her MO?
It's a she for sure.
It's a she.
Yeah. She is, she just wants to be the best. Like she just wants to be better than anybody else. Yeah. And God bless her. She, I think, I did some counseling over the years, particularly when I was writing Beyond the Point, and my counselor had some really helpful tips and tricks for me. Kind of teaching me that critical voice does have a role to play. Sure. And that she is really deep down wants it to be great. Mm-hmm. And that is why all of the nitpicking in my head comes. But a lot of times I don't need that voice until a lot later down the road. And now that I've been working with you on some of my writing, Jonathan, I often think about you, not in a critical, negative way, but I think about the things I've learned from some of the classes that you've taught, and I evaluate what I'm writing based on some of those things, which at times can be helpful and at times can hinder the flow. Because really, if you can just start writing and get sentences down, it doesn't matter if they're good or bad. It's just getting the raw material, kind of like if you're making a pie and you've got the eggs and the flour and the sugar. Really just writing some really crummy sentences is kind of like getting your ingredients out. Yeah. And then you figure out what needs to get cracked open. So,
yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that your inner critic doesn't now talk like me. I'm glad it's still a girl.
Well, she's a girl, and then there's you on the other side. So you're
stereo.
A good team.
Oh, that's good. It is so important, though. I often say the way I sort of manage the inner critic is to it's not about silencing the inner critic. It's about saying, hey, I value you inner critic, and I need you to go occupy yourself for a little while, and then I want you to come back, and I really want to hear what you have to say.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, that makes it easier for my inner critic to go when he knows he's valued, and he's going to be invited back into the room.
Have you ever read your writing out loud to yourself or recorded yourself reading your writing?
You mean like early at some point no, I mean, I've only done, no, I mean, after it was completely done and it was sort of out there for consumption, I recorded the Wilder King books and audiobooks, but, no, I've never done that.
I'm kind of curious because I did listen to the audiobook for Beyond the Point, and listening to it, I was so, this is going to sound really bad, I was proud of it. I was like, oh, this is really, I'm enjoying it, And so I wonder, because my critical eye, when I go back to read it as I'm writing it, I break it apart so much as I'm rereading it back to myself the next day or, whatever. And so there's a part of me now, I'm wondering if part of my discipline might become reading it out loud, recording that, it, and then listening to it.
That's interesting. Because
I feel like if you listen to it, the ear might be a different vessel than the eye. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, I think. My question is,
maybe that's just a huge waste of time.
What's your goal? But your goal in doing that is to feel better about what you've written,
I think it's to, maybe feel better about what I've written, or maybe hear what parts ring true and what parts feel off.
Yeah.
I don't know. I found the listening experience to be more encouraging than I had anticipated. I anticipated listening to my novel back and just like cringing the whole time.
Mm-hmm. And you didn't, but you weren't the reader.
I didn't read it.
Yeah. Well, that had never occurred to me before. That's an interesting thing. I think, I would be concerned about listening to it as a way of making oneself less rigorous.
Oh, like giving yourself a break.
Yeah. So,
okay.
To say,
it sounds okay.
This looks weird to my eye, but it sounds okay. Well, your reader's still looking at it with an eye.
No, that's a fair point. Yeah, that's good.
But I love the idea of that as a way of achieving some critical distance.
Some distance, right? When you did that with your hands, you kind of separated your hands just now.
Yeah.
That, I think, is really what I'm after.
Yeah.
Especially to give myself permission to move on to the next scene.
Right.
In the early drafting process.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I can get stuck where I'm just rewriting the same scene or the same chapter over and over and over again. And if I could just get it down, listen to it, feel like, oh yeah, that kind of gets to it, let's move forward. Yeah. I think that could be helpful. But I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking through, would that be a helpful tool
a question I often get is, how do you know when you're done? Because you can always keep tweaking. And I wonder if that is a possible method toward knowing when you're done.
Well, and people say, I've heard other writers talk about the importance of reading your work out loud to yourself, which, I mean, they're not recording it, but same process of like listening to it in addition to just writing it down. But that critical voice is real. And I was just talking to someone this morning who said they had written a lot of things, but the two questions that came up in their mind were, number one, who cares? And number two, or who is going to care? And then number two, what gives me the right to be the person to say this? And the person I was speaking to this morning said that those questions were what had shut him down and stopped him. And I kind of pushed back on him, like, you're not unique. Like, those are the questions that every writer or artist, I think, hears. And I think it's the ability to either answer those questions or not answer them and move forward anyway.
And so who cares then to treat that not as a rhetorical question,
right,
but as a real question that has an answer.
Right, exactly. Like this, I'm trying to write this new book that is going to be a little bit about adoption, and I've really thought through who is going to care about this. I'm hoping to write it for a specific person, being basically myself 5 years ago. If I had picked up a novel about what I was about to live through, would I have felt understood and known? And encouraged.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's helpful to have an answer.
You, because you have adopted recently, you have I say recently, what, 2 years ago?
Year and a half.
Year and a half ago. You are part of a community of, so you're talking about a situation here where your audience is not an abstraction,
Right.
but actually a community of people who you can write to serve. And
because we've adopted, there have been more people that have come around in my life that I knew in college or that I knew at another time that have come knocking and have been like, hey, tell me about what it's like. And we're in the weeds, what does it look like a few yards forward? And I think those are conversations we've been having a lot, my husband and I, with other couples. So it's very fresh, and I see their faces, and I know the struggles that we all have been going through. So
yeah. A conversation I've been having a lot lately with writers, and I can't remember, I may have had it in a previous episode of this podcast now. I can't remember which conversations I've had where.
Sure.
But the idea is so important of thinking in terms of your audience, not as America.
Right.
or, but as you writing to serve your community to the extent that you can.
Yeah.
And I just think that it's so incredibly important. And I love to hear you talking about this with adoption, with, you as you are working through this book, you are thinking in terms of people, actual people with faces and voices, including, 5 years ago, Claire.
Right. And I think that for me, maybe because I'm a narcissist, I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe it's help. And also because, like, at the end of the day, what if nobody buys the book? That's the other question that comes to your head. And so let's answer that rhetorical question. If no one buys the book, I still wrote it for my former self. I still wrote it for me and for the experiences that I went through, and in a way to pay homage to that person who survived, and that sounds kind of weird, but I feel like it is so cool to write a book and kind of do some healing. Writing Beyond the Point was healing for me because one of my major life regrets was always not going to West Point. And so I used that feeling of, man, I wonder what that would have been like, or should I have done that? And I poured it into a book, and I lived that experience of what it would have been like by writing it. And I now can walk away from that regret and feel like, yeah, I didn't go to West Point, but I did something, and I experienced it in a way through writing, and that feels like a win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the second question you said the inner critic asks is what gives you the right or the authority to
be the person to write this.
Okay.
Well, yeah,
How do you answer that question.
Again, I mean, people say write what you know. And so I had the authority to write about West Point and women in the military, not because I was a woman in the military, but because I did have some content knowledge about West Point, having grown up there.
Yeah.
And I answer that question by going back to the first question, which is I have the authority because I'm writing this for these people. I may not be the most expert in the room, but I'm doing it as an act of service.
Yeah.
So it's less about who gives you the authority and more of this is an act of service to those people.
Yeah.
I think that's my answer. As a writer, I've learned that now. By writing a book that was inspired by true stories, I think that works for me. That unlocked something. Like if I'm doing this for someone else, then it helps silence that second question a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a question that is related to authority or where we get our authority as writers from is by giving the reader something they couldn't get for themselves.
That's good. Talk more about that.
Well, no, you're the guest.
No, I want to learn from you. I'm like, this is why I'm here, to learn.
But the originality is not something we can pursue directly.
Yes.
We can tell the truth about what we've seen, and trust that what I've seen, the combination of things I've seen, is unique.
Yes.
And the way we put things together, is unique. And even if I had a twin who saw everything I saw, even then my perspective on that would be slightly different from the twin. So our authority in many ways, I think, does come down to, am I or am I not giving the reader something they couldn't get for themselves? So whenever if I were to write a detective story, really all I've got to fall back on is the same episodes of CSI that you've seen.
Right.
And I'm a long way from having the authority to write a detective story. I might could get there if it were that important to me. I could probably figure out some way to learn enough that I could give somebody something. But when I'm dealing with student writing, young, college age people or younger, I find them, so often falling back on the same TV
just
shows I've seen anyway.
Stuff, right?
Yeah. And it's not. And it really feels like they don't have the authority to write about that. On the other hand, when you're writing about, you're writing about West Point or, but even, that's a little too dramatic because.
Well, the way that I jumped that gap in knowledge or authority, as you're calling it, is I recruited the authority. So I recruited the details. I recruited the stories. I recruited the concrete that I didn't have in my own brain or in my own experience. And so I do agree with you that there is certain experience that each human has just based on where their 2 feet are on the planet.
Right. Yeah. And you're always having to walk that tightrope between, on the one hand, writing about experiences that people can relate to, and on the other hand, giving them something they couldn't get on their own. And so,
yeah, it's the magic, right? Yeah. I heard just the other day that I think it was Seth Rogen talking on a podcast of all things. And
he's a movie maker?
He makes movies, super bad, like kind of raunchy
gotcha.
movies. Yeah. Sorry, Rabbit Room. Don't go see them, I guess. I don't know. But he was talking about the process of writing with scripts. And he said kind of about what you were just talking about, like balancing those two things of writing what you know, but also being relatable. He talked about hooking people with plot, but then handing them a story, and how basically, plot is a device to kind of like hook people in and get them interested in like, oh, what's going to happen next? But then you actually hand them a deeper meaning. And the deeper meaning is the part that people connect to, whether they've ever gone on a heist or, smoked weed, which a lot of his movies, that's what he talks about. But whether they've done any of those things, the story, the deeper meaning is what they connect to. And I was like, yeah, Seth Rogen, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Like, I'll take that and run with that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
One more time. What's the difference between story and plot?
Plot, I guess, is what happens, and story, the way he would talk about it is plot is what happens, and story is the the emotional arc of what's happening. Yeah. Like the deeper. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's the first time I've heard it. I don't know if I agree. I haven't.
I've been mulling over it the last couple days, and for me, I think it's true. I remember in my first novel, some of the very early drafts were very plot driven. But when I would read through the manuscript, it would feel like you're just getting dragged through plot. So, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. And so it was missing story, which is the emotional arc that kind of pulls you along and makes you root for the people as they're going through these different trials. Yeah.
I guess plot is something that you could you could make an outline of, and I'm trying to get from this point to this point to this point. And so, yes, I'm going to agree with you. What I would also say is plot is one way to draw your reader in, and plot is the way Seth Rogen draws his readers, his viewers in. And then there are stories that you realize, I love that story, and there was very little plot there.
Right. That's true.
And I think that's also freeing for a storyteller to know that this doesn't all depend on plot.
True. That's true.
And I'm trying to think of a story I read recently that I just love. I wish I could remember what it was. Now, this is not going to be very helpful. This is what show notes are for.
Right.
But I remember reading it, loving it, and then realized there was no plot here. I just love this because this character is so compelling.
That's interesting. So for me, I kind of disagree. Like, I rarely find myself attracted to stories where nothing happens. Like, I need that urgency, that feeling of urgency is important to me when I'm reading. Otherwise, it's too tempting to do something else for me. Maybe because I'm...
Watch Real Housewives. Or...
Oh, stop it. You threw that back in my face. Earlier, he found out that I have watched that at some point in my past. I'm sure someone listening to this has also happened to see a Real Housewives episode.
Maybe. You may be right. I don't know.
No, maybe not. Maybe everyone listening to Rabbit Room loves just literary masterpieces. But I do find that I like the pull of, what is going to happen next. And I care about this person in literature. But I'm getting better and more disciplined, to bring that word back, to commit to stories even if I don't feel that pull right away.
As a reader.
As a reader. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to hear you talk a little bit about how you get from, Beyond the Point was based on interviews. It was based on, you really did a lot of research on that. What did you find as you were turning that big pile of facts, that big pile of, reality into fiction?
Well, I found, first of all, that I needed a better organization system.
Okay.
So I wish I could say that I have some beautiful file on my computer that has all of the interviews in a row. And that's just not true. They're all over the place in notebooks and recordings and old hard drives. So, but I did find that truth is better than fiction for me. I don't know.
Not just for you, for everybody.
I don't know if I had tried to write a novel from thin air about women at West Point. Like, I couldn't have done that. There was no way that I would have been able to do that. And so it was really helpful for me to be able to have concrete details that I could go back to in case I got lost. And also just women that I could call when, let's say, I'm writing a story or a moment in the book about Kuwait. I've never been to Kuwait. I could call my friend and say, hey, tell me again about Kuwait. I know I interviewed you a year ago, 2 years ago. I have the notes in front of me. I need more. This isn't, these notes aren't filling it out for me. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it felt like or what you saw as you're riding in on the bus, and those details were crucial and critical. And it brought the writing, I think it brought the writing to life more. And now now that I've had this novel come out, I love that as a structure for myself. That the way that I think I'm going to write novels into the future is I'm going to have people that I interview that then I can turn to during the writing process. And also those people that I've interviewed become the people I'm writing it for, to go back to that question. And so what I found is it was super helpful, and also it created this kind of baked in network of cheerleaders for the process, because they wanted to see it come to life too. So
to return to Kuwait for a minute, one thing that I thought about as you were talking about calling a person about Kuwait is that I have an idea in my head of what Kuwait is like. And if I were to write that, this is getting back to what I said earlier about having the authority to write anything.
Right.
If I were to write what I imagine Kuwait to be, it would be the same thing you already thought Kuwait was before you called that person.
Right.
And what you're really looking for is that thing about Kuwait that would surprise
expecting.
you.
Yeah.
And that's when it starts to feel real.
I remember one detail someone told me. There were two things that stuck out even as I'm talking to you now that came back to mind. One was that they had Kuwaiti and Iraqi bus drivers that would drive the soldiers and officers from the airport to Kuwait. And I remember one of the females I interviewed talked about getting on the bus and the bus driver was playing a recorded track of Arabic prayers over the loudspeaker in the bus. And she just had to listen to that as they were driving in. And it was just this rude awakening or welcome to her whole new, you know, world. And then the other thing she talked about was a woman walking on the side of the road in full, you know, burqa.
Yeah.
And just walking by herself in the middle of the desert. It's really hard to see, where did you come from? Where are you going? You're just walking along a barren road by yourself. And that picture, that image of a woman walking along the side of the road alongside this bus has really stuck with me, because it's sort of an eerie picture to a Western mind, where you're like, that's a very unfamiliar sight.
Yeah.
And kind of stark. Like, where is that woman going? It's hot outside. You don't even have a water bottle in your hand. You know, things like that really stuck with me about what these women saw. And I never saw, but I was able to put that onto a page that they now get to turn to and show their kids someday and say, hey, I went there and this is what I did when I was there, which I think was cool for me to be a part of.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And so...
How about... I want to ask you questions. Is that allowed? I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe
not. We have a few minutes. Sure, ask me a question.
Well, how do you do research for the things that you've written?
Yeah.
Who do you call, or who have you called?
Well, I mean, for the fiction I've written, I call geologists or
that's interesting.
Or,
okay.
you know, biology. I mean, you know, I'm so interested in the natural world, and even though my stories are set in a fictional place, it's a fictional place that looks a whole lot like. I mean, that I wasn't trying to, you know, do
recreate
world building, as in, you know, there aren't any animals there that don't actually live in Georgia and Florida, and there aren't any trees there that don't grow in Georgia and Florida. And so I was just really, I have a geologist friend who was a unofficial consultant, and I just called him, and he always had some interesting fact that would turn out to be the key to the story.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, and so that was all part of a confidence that the landscape itself contains stories, and I mean, I just believe that that the actual just the way that God put the world together. If you pay enough attention to this, you know, the way this tree reproduces or whatever, something's going to come out of it.
That's really cool.
That's not just that I had that confidence about the natural world. It's like I feel like if you just pay attention to the way the world works,
right,
in interpersonal relationships or in whatever, you know, stories begin to come out.
And I feel that way about the people that I meet. I feel like I could probably talk with a person in the grocery store line and leave that conversation feeling like I should write a novel about that person. You know, I feel that way deeply, that there really are stories everywhere, and I love that you find inspiration in the landscape. I think that's admirable, and I wish I paid more attention to that world. I kill plants often, but I think that's really beautiful and true.
Yeah, and one thing I was interested in is, you know, the idea of that particular landscape sort of telling stories, as opposed to, you know, the Rockies are a little more glamorous than the river bottom swamps, you know, and I just I wanted to tell those stories. I thought it'd be interesting to sort of dig into those and see what happened. So, yeah. So you talked about talking to somebody in the grocery store line, and for you, interviewing is becoming an important part of the way you get stuff. Give me, let's kind of wrap up with some practical ideas about generating ideas through conversation.
Sure. So, kind of what to ask someone?
Yeah, I mean, are there questions that you ask? Are there...
So I kind of approach interviews kind of like a counselor. So I find that it's better to ask a person to tell you a story rather than to say, you know, to ask them specific questions. You know, when I earlier when I said I called and said, "Tell me about Kuwait," It was because I was looking for something in particular. But in my initial interviews, I was way more interested in anecdotes and in scenes rather than in generalizations or timelines from them. A lot of the women wanted to walk me through their timelines, but in terms of where they were at what point. I graduated West Point in this year, and then I went here. Like, that stuff doesn't really matter for a novelist.
Sure.
So I think treating those conversations like a counselor and really listening and really caring about what they're saying and really wanting to get to know them first as a friend and then later, only like long time later, as a novelist. Really being able to be emotionally available as you're sitting there across from them and talking, and listening to where they maybe stop short, where they start to get emotional and then they kind of close off. Yeah. And then, gently asking to go a little bit further and ask, I noticed that you choked up just then, or I noticed you said something really hard and then you crossed your arms and got kind of quiet. Do you mind telling me why you did that? Like, really watching their body language. Yeah. Because a lot of times when you're asking someone about something sensitive, they're not going to hand it over right away, nor should they.
Right. That's right. Speaking of authority, right?
Oh, do we have some?
No, I'm saying that having the authority to ask some of these questions,
and not expecting that they are going to give it. Like, you might probe a little more, and they still don't open up more, and that's okay too. Yeah, that happened to me many times when we were having conversations. So having the humility to ask and not be offended either direction. So I often ask, tell me something that would surprise me about blank. Often about people's work or their hometown. Interesting.
People like talking about their hometowns.
Yeah. I also like questions like, tell me a story about a person that, met you in a time of need, or tell me a story about a time that you felt like you wanted to quit or that you were not going to move forward, and then why did you? Stories where they defied their own expectations, I think, helped me kind of get to the bottom of their motivations. Yeah. So, and then I think just having tools that helped me do the recording and transcribing were really helpful.
That's interesting.
But in the end, I think it's just making those relationships that, whether or not the novel was ever going to come out of it, having those relationships be a solid friendship really mattered to me. Yeah. And I think the women felt that, and then they were willing to be even more vulnerable.
Yeah. Okay, last question. Who are the writers that make you want to write? Which is different from who are your favorite writers.
Yeah. I always say John Steinbeck, and he's a writer that makes me want to write, and he's a writer that's my favorite writer. I love what he does with story and description and human motivation, human interpersonal relationships, all that. Writers that make me want to write. Flannery O'Connor, when I...
Correct.
Yes, I know how much you love her as well. This is going to sound like a cheesy answer, but the Bible, can I answer that?
Sure.
It's like the Sunday school answer. I do read the Bible a lot, and I just find it so full of weird, seemingly rabbit holes and interesting people that make terrible choices, and I just find it to be a really fascinating book that makes me think there's story everywhere. And I like that the Bible isn't it's not just a dry narration, it's not just an ethical document.
Right.
It's stories about people's families, it's stories about people's sex lives, it's stories about kings, it's all of it, and I really find it to be a motivating place to be reading.
Yeah.
That's kind of a cheesy answer, but it's true.
There's nothing cheesy. It's great stories. All right, Claire, thank you so much.
Okay.
Claire Gibson.
Thank you for having me. I cannot wait to listen to all the other interviews that you've been doing.
There have been some great ones.
I'm really excited that you invited me. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. See you soon.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio and the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to the Arcadian Wild for allowing us to use their delightful song Finch in the Pantry as part of this podcast. Check out their album of the same name for more excellent music.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to fostering Christ-centered community and spiritual formation through music, story, and art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.